Okay, we've been talking about archaeology and some basic things about it. This course we're going to try to learn a little bit about archaeology as well as about specifically the archaeology of the Greco-Roman period. Some of you have asked about, you have to do these site reports. Let me mention just a couple of things about that I think might help you. They might require you going to the library. The library, by the way, is that building on campus that's got some books in it and tables. So I assume you know where it is. I don't know how often you go there. In the library, you should find a work called the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Let me just mention that one first. ABD, some people call it, people in the know. Anchor Bible Dictionary. And by the way, when I say a dictionary or an encyclopedia, you might think of like Webster's Dictionary and Encyclopedia Britannica, but there are several dictionaries and encyclopedias. Okay? Some of them, a lot of them in biblical studies. So Anchor Bible Dictionary is a standard reference work in biblical studies. It's, I think, 6 volumes, or maybe it's 7. They're maroon covers, and they like A to C, D to F, or whatever. It's listed alphabetically. There are many, many entries. Every city, every place name that's mentioned in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Apocrypha has an entry, and usually with some bibliography. Okay? So in other words, if you are looking for basic information about some place mentioned in the Bible, it's a good place to start. Okay? In our age of computers, we kind of overlook it. Anyway, I wrote 18 entries in that dictionary myself. Mine were short ones, but there are hundreds and hundreds of entries. So there'd be something there. And some of the bigger sites have major articles in there, like say Ephesus or Jerusalem, be several pages long. That's a good place to start. And you'll find other Bible dictionaries as well. Erdman's has one. Zondervan Publishers has one. I've written for like 3 or 4 different Bible dictionaries. Some of them are 1 volume, some of them are multi-volume. That's a good place to start. Another place to take a look would be some journals. There are journals, or we might call them magazines, that deal with archaeology, especially the archaeology we're talking about. I have one right here. It's called Near Eastern Archaeology. I just got this in the mail. This is the latest issue. I could pass it around so you can take a look at it. This one seems to be focused on the site of Lake Kish. So I'm going to pass this around and let you take a look at it. Near Eastern Archaeology is published by ASOR, which is the American School of Oriental Research. So I'll just pass that around. These come out, I think that one comes out 4 times a year. There's another magazine called Biblical Archaeology Review, or BAR. Biblical Archaeology Review is a very good place to look. It's been published now since the 1975 or something. You could search for it online. I'm sure our library has much of it, or there are databases, online databases that will have stuff from this as well. Okay, Biblical Archaeology Review. We'll have a lot of articles related to sites and to their archaeology. Okay, that's another one. There's a magazine just called Archaeology. Archaeology, our class, applied history class, is going to hear an archaeology lecture later in the semester over at the University of South Florida. That is sponsored by the American Institute of Archaeology, which has a chapter at the University of South Florida, has chapters all around the country. This particular lecture will be about Troy. So you can find in Archaeology magazine broader view of Greco-Roman archaeology than say Biblical Archaeology Review. So you'll have stuff in there about Troy. So yeah, if you want to choose a classical Greek site, or it's more what you might consider classical Roman site, like something along Hadrian's Wall or Londinium or whatever, something like that, that's fine too. We don't have to be constrained to that for your sites. So Archaeology magazine, Biblical Archaeology Review. Let's see, what other ones do I want to mention? There are some that are very specifically oriented to the Bible. One's called the Biblical Illustrator, which is actually put out by the Southern Baptist Denomination Association. And it's guided towards Sunday school lessons, but it gives background. Very good stuff in there as well. Bible in the Spade is another one. So anyway, there are lots of journals like this. Each one has its own particular focus or flavor. So do not neglect these things. There's another one called the Oxford Encyclopedia of Near Eastern Studies. I'll try to get a list and I'll bring it in or I'll post it, okay? Of some of these places be a good place to start. Good place to start for your paper and for these presentations. All right, enough about that, potential sources. Of course, another good place to find these sites is just by flipping through your textbook. He mentions many sites there. If you really get stuck, send me an email and I can, or just tell me in general what you're interested in. Hopefully you're interested in something related to this course, and I can help direct you to, because there's literally hundreds of sites that you could do these reports on, or your paper. North Africa, Italy, England, Spain, Turkey, Israel, of course, Jordan, Egypt. It's not really limited. Okay? All right. And I hesitate to produce a list because part of what I want this experience to be is for you to see how many sites there are and try to figure out what sources there are. I think we all tend now today to just Google something and then we find it there, and whatever we find on Google is the limit of our research. You also need to be going to the library's website and exploring their databases, which they have a lot of material. If you don't understand how to do that, go to the library and ask one of the librarians for some help. They're very helpful. Okay? All right. Methods of archaeology. You have a chance to go dig in Israel this summer with me if you would like. We can certainly arrange that, but you need to be thinking about it, making your plans, especially if you don't have a passport. If you're even thinking about it, you ought to get a passport. More and more, you need a passport for a lot of things you didn't used to need them for. You need a passport to even go to Mexico these days. I don't know about Canada, maybe Canada too now. The days of using your driver's license as your ID are quickly coming to an end. So passport is more valuable today than ever. But see me about that or send me an email. It's open to students to go. you can get credit for it. So it's middle of June to the middle of July. All right. We went out and did our Florida dig. Was that just last Saturday? It seems like a month ago, but it was just a few days ago, for which we are on television. I posted a link to it on the site, so you can take a look at that. If you haven't seen it, you might like to see it. So how do we dig? You know, I was just on this cruise where I was asked to speak. I spoke 6 times, and I spoke about archaeology. One of the sessions that I did, I called it FAQ with an archaeology, frequently asked questions. One of the most frequently asked questions that I get is, you know, how do you know where to dig? Another one is, do you find anything? Some people ask, how do you dig? Other people have asked me, how does that stuff get buried? In other words, are these ancient people digging holes and burying it and covering it up and then you go find it? Kind of like a pirate, you know, pirate's treasure. I can't say that never happens. There are times when we find things that have been hidden, but mostly it's happening through what you might call natural processes or catastrophe, right? Earthquake, knock stuff over. People come and attack a place, a city, a building, they burn it, things collapse in. But then just over time, wind will blow soil and dirt, water will carry it, and things get covered. I guess the short answer to that one is, in our society today, right here in America, if we're going to build something, we go in and we totally rip out what was there before. So if there's a building sitting on a piece of property, like I just drove by on South Florida, right? I guess they're building a new fancy grocery store where there was a Kmart, right? The Kmart was completely leveled and all dug out and undoubtedly put on the back of dump trucks and hauled to a landfill, all the rubble of the Kmart. And now they'll build a brand new building there. Okay, it doesn't always happen that way, but that's the way it often happens. We haul everything away. Therefore, if an archaeologist goes there to dig, there will be nothing to find of the Kmart. Very, very little, right? But in ancient times, I guess good for the archaeologist, there are remains, because what people tended to do is reuse the building blocks, reuse the things that are there, level it out. So they'd level out the building area and then build on top of it. So that's why we find layer after layer after layer of different buildings. Okay, so maybe that explains some of it. So now when we go to locate a site, how do we do that? Well, one of the things, of course, since I work in historic archaeology for the most part, although this dig in Florida is not historic, technically I guess it'd be prehistoric, because there are no written records in North America really before 1500. That's the definition of prehistoric. Doesn't have to be, you know, like thousands and thousands of years ago. It can just be a couple hundred years ago, before we had written records. But if we have any written records, those are good things to look at. All right? So in the case of Israel and Jordan and that part of the world, obviously the Bible becomes a thing. The New Testament becomes a source. But there are other sources as well, things like writings like Josephus and others. So we look for anything mentioned in a text that might give us clues. Even the ancient city of Troy, for example, we have Homer's writings. Homer mentions the layout of the city. He mentions the streams or the rivers that are there and so forth. So this gives you clues as to where a site might be. Any textual references. The other thing we have are the names, the current names of places, right? Current names of places can be an indication of the occupation of a site. All right? Let me think of one. Well, think of one that's local. I don't know a lot of the local stuff yet, but, you know, if a name has something like Tarpon Springs comes to mind, right? Tarpon Springs. Or a name that, St. Petersburg. It's interesting that in Florida we have a city called St. Petersburg, you know, which is a Russian city. I don't know the history of the city, but I assume...
The guy who founded it was from there.
He was from there, okay. So that gives us our connection. So place names, Lakeland, that was named by Fred Lakeland, who first moved here. No, I think we have 38 lakes within the city limits of Lakeland, something like that, some unbelievable number. Although when you drive around town, you run into them all the time, right? That's why none of the roads are straight around here. And you think you're going to make it, and then all of a sudden you run into a lake, and then you got to go around it and find your way around it. So I'm still learning all that. But yes, I used to live in a town called Grayson, Kentucky. That was actually named for an assistant of George Washington. And he gave him that land, okay, as a kind of reward for serving him. Anyway, so names hold things that are there. Now, when we're talking about something, say, over in Israel or in Jordan, for example, I worked on a site called Abila. We call it Abila. The ancient name is Abila. The local people do not call it Abila. But there is a name called Quelba, which is associated with it. There are other names around it. The name comes from Abel. Abel is in the Old Testament, means a place that's a meadow or a green pasture, something that is watered year-round. So if you read through the Old Testament especially, you'll find a lot of Abels mentioned. Abel Mahola, Abel Beth Makkah, and so on. So the current name can be something. And of course in the Middle East, the current Arabic name for a place can preserve sometimes in part or in form the ancient name. And that's the way a lot of places were discovered. One of the earliest explorers of Israel and Palestine was William Robinson, and he was a real scholar of Hebrew and Greek and stuff. And so he also traveled with a guy who was very good with Arabic. And so they would go and just ask the people, "What do you call this place?" Or do you know a place by this name? And then the name, they'd say, "Oh, well, there's a place that has this name, which is similar, over here." And they would go look and talk to the people there. So this is how you get some information, is by place names, text. We could add surface survey. Yes?
In Greece.
In Greece?
The New Testament city of Thessalonica, like Thessaloniki or something like that?
They call it Thessaloniki today, yes. Thessaloniki, in the Bible we call it Thessalonica. It's a big city. I think it's the second largest city in Greece today. It has like 1 million people or more. So yes, Thessaloniki or Thessalonica. Yes, sometimes it's just the way we pronounce it. But sometimes the name is altered. We'll find a few examples of those. All right. Sometimes people purposely change a name. For example, when the Romans took over Jerusalem, they changed the name on purpose. Didn't call it Jerusalem anymore. Well, another thing to do it once you have located an area, or you're thinking about working in an area, one thing that many archaeologists will do, it's very common now, it's been very common probably for the last 20 years, and I think it'll probably still happen, that is to walk across the ground, walk across the surface, and do what we call surface survey. Surface survey. Just as the name implies, you are not digging. You're just walking across the surface. You're surveying it. You're looking at it to see any artifacts that are there. Like when I went out to that site in Florida, the first thing I did was walk around the clearing. How did I know about that? The people there told me, hey, you know, we've seen stuff here. There are stories about things being here, and it's in this area, this part of our land. And so I went there, and the first thing I noticed was animals, I think turtles, because I saw one going in the hole. May not all be turtles, but the turtle digs a hole, goes in the hole, maybe they're laying their eggs in there or whatever. It's not too far from the river, anyway, to get out of the sun or whatever. And as they're digging out soil, they're digging out, in this case, shells and pottery and bones. That gets it up on the surface. So that when I walk around, I look down and say, wow, here is pottery. Here are a lot of shells. There's something down here. So let's dig here, okay? So there are indications on the surface. If you go across the Middle East, there's a lot more pottery than there is here in North America. You'll find pottery laying there. When you find a concentration of pottery, you can then collect it, clean it, record it, and say, okay, I've got Roman pottery, I've got Bronze Age pottery, I've got Byzantine pottery, that sort of thing. And so then you begin to get a profile of the people who live there. That's a surface survey. That's a good indicator. Then when you're going to get ready to start, you need to lay out a datum point. In the Middle East, we tend to lay out a grid. There at Florida, I laid out a datum line. I put a line in, I ran a line that was straight. Okay? Working with limited equipment there, but I put in a point and I ran a tape 100 meters long. That's pretty far. And then every 20 meters I put in a stake. They're still out there. And so I can measure off of that to triangulate where we're digging is. Okay? Later on, you know, if I need it, I mean, I also use a GPS to give me some coordinates. If I want to get more precise, I could go back there with, if I had the equipment, I could go back there with like a total station, and I could shoot that datum line in, then everything I put in would be related to that datum line. Okay, so, but in the Middle East, we do a grid. So what a lot of places will do is they will lay out the grid of the site before they ever excavate. The site that I worked on in central Jordan, we had a surveyor come. You have to find an elevation. I helped him. We went out, we found an old British datum point. You know, the British Army was in that area. They laid out the Palestinian grid, and they put in angle iron is what they used. They took angle iron, pretty deep, pounded it in, and they bent it over, and then they shot that point in. It's hard to find that in the middle of, you know, you kind of know where they are. They're marked on the maps, but then you have to go find that. And we found it. I found it. We set up over it. Then we could shoot from there to establish our grid. Other times there's a point along where they've been building a road. You know, when guys that build roads survey, so they're doing some of the work for you. You can run it off of that point. So you have to find a benchmark, a datum point, to do that. And then you go up on the site and you lay out a grid. It's much like playing the game Battleship. You ever played the game Battleship? I don't know if people play it anymore. It used to be on a little board, you had little pegs, probably newfangled now. You just do it, you just think about it and it appears in your mind when they put those optical readers on your retina or whatever, however they're doing it these days. You know, you kids got all the equipment. But anyway, Battleship, you have a grid, right? A4, B9, stuff like that. And so you're trying to figure out where the enemy ships are, and they're supposed to tell you honestly when you hit their ship. I've known people who would move their ships. I'm sure no one in this room would do that. So somebody went B9 or something. You were at B9, you thought, ooh. No, that's a miss. You know, so anyway. So you get the idea. By using the grid coordinates, you can begin to figure out where things are. And that's what we do. When you go in the dig, you don't want to just dig random holes anywhere. You need to locate them in space, right? X, Y, Z coordinates. So a grid really helps to do more precise measurements. So that's what we do. You see it here on the screen, bottom right. There's a trench on the left, there are squares on the right. You see up above a picture of somebody digging a square. And you notice that as you're digging, you dig precisely, try to dig down straight. Notice that they have left a vertical wall, if you will, in the square. We call that a bulk. B-A-L-K, bulk. The bulk then is, I guess if you're British, you might put a U in there too, but we're not British. So the bulk then allows you to see the stratigraphy, see the layers. And you can begin to draw that and record that. Okay, so then you do it systematically. So systematic excavation is the key, record keeping, paperwork, which could then be entered on a computer. I know a few places that, you know, have, I don't know, 20 iPads or something, 20, and they have people put all the data straight away into an iPad, you know, into a database that way. I've yet to work on an excavation that way because, first of all, it's expensive to buy all that equipment. Secondly, digging is very hard on electronic equipment. Rain, if you're in a place that rains, dust, heat. Also, seeing a screen in the bright sunlight is a challenge. If you've ever tried to use your smartphone out in the bright sun, you know, sometimes it's hard to see it. So imagine you've got like an iPad screen, you're trying to type on it with your fingers, or however, and then it's hard to see, and maybe you drop it, somebody drops a rock on it, that's it. Drop a rock on my notebook, no big deal. Drop a rock on my iPad, that could be trouble. So, I think that's the way it's going to go. It's already moving that way. You would directly put stuff into some kind of a input device, whether it's an iPad, a laptop, or something. But the challenges are, of course, battery power. A lot of sites, you don't have any access to electrical power. You'd have to get a generator, you know, and then charge stuff that way, or hope they last all day, and then just the damage. So for right now, still, it's very common to use a notebook, sheets of paper, which can then be scanned into a computer, or I suppose, if you really have a big budget and a lot of time, you could enter all that data into some kind of database afterwards. That's part of the problem. It's hard to do. It's time consuming. Because remember, there's no money in this archaeology. Let me show you this as just an example. This is an aerial photo. Okay, when I look at it, I see a lot of stuff because I know what I'm looking at. I worked there many, many years. But this is actually taken by the British. I think it was after World War II. I don't know the exact year. I don't remember the exact year, but probably, let's say, in the 1950s. So this photo is now, what, 60, at least 60 years old, maybe more. Quite a story behind getting this photo, but I won't take time to tell that today. But I obtained it from the Royal Geographic Society of Jordan. And these photos come in stereo pairs. You ever heard of stereo pairs? You ever heard of that kind of thing? You've heard of that.
Positive and the negative, right?
Well, what it does, first of all, you need an airplane. Secondly, you need a fixed camera on the bottom of the airplane or someplace like that. You don't want to just be holding a phone and doing it or something. So you want something that's very fixed. And as you fly over, somebody presses the thing, and of course these are using a shutter and actually using film. And so they're just taking a whole course of photos. maybe for the whole flight, but certainly when they get to certain coordinates. All right, by doing that, what that means is you got a plane flying over, and the plane needs to be flying straight, you know, and it needs to be at a level elevation. So you want the plane flying at, I don't know what this was, let's say 3,000 feet or something, and it's going north. And it takes a series of pictures. What that means then is when you develop those pictures, you have basically kind of like, you know, if you put them together, sort of like a movie, right? Because you've got a series of images like every second or so. Now, if you put those things side by side and you use what's called a stereoscope, you can get a 3D effect. When I was a kid, we had a thing called a ViewMaster. You ever heard of a ViewMaster? Has a little wheel you put in it, has two pictures that you look through at the same time. That's exactly what this is. So the wheel of the ViewMaster, if you looked at it carefully, which I'm sure you did if you had one, it has pretty much looks like the same picture. So if you got a wheel that's got, I don't know, let's say 24 images on it, 12 of them are the same as the other 12. They're just slightly different. They're taken from a slightly different angle. So when you look at it with your eyes through the ViewMaster, ooh, comes in 3D, right? You know what I'm talking about? Well, if not, you know. Of course, that's been around even long before ViewMasters, but this has military, used to have anyway, military purpose as well as scientific purpose, because it allows you then, from the comfort and privacy of your own space, to really look closely at the surface of the earth, and you can see it in 3 dimensions. And usually the change in elevation is exaggerated. Okay? And so that's good, because that means if something is, let's say 2 feet high, it may appear to be like 4 feet high, so it's going to really show up. Anyway, that's another way to do it. You can use aerial photos and now we have all other kinds of remote sensing, it's called. Remote sensing, which uses satellite images that are taken. And a lot of times now, instead of just light source, of course, with a satellite with a remote sensing, you can now look at all different bands of wavelengths of light, infrared, you know, and so forth. So by looking at these different bands of light and merging those images together, you can begin to map things that are there, like vegetation that's there and so forth. Some things are at different temperatures as well. They can have thermal imaging as well as optic imagery. So all kinds of stuff's happening with remote sensing, all kinds of stuff happening with satellite imagery. There's a woman who now calls herself a space archaeologist. I know this is a marketing thing, because, you know, I'm going, what, space archaeologist? You know, but it makes you stop and think about it, right? There is no field called space archaeology. She just kind of made that name up, and she's gotten millions of dollars doing it, so more power to her. She teaches up in Alabama, and basically she's just doing what other people have been doing, but she's been able to really market it. So she got like one of these, what was it? Was it like a TED grant? It was some kind of grant. She got like $1 million grant to go out and do some of this stuff. So basically she's going to sites, she's using remote sensing, and then since she's got money, she can go to the guys digging there and say, hey, I think we should dig here, and I've got some money to help make that happen. And so they say, sure, you got the money, let's make it happen. Okay? And so she has worked in Egypt, and she has worked in Italy, and she has worked, I think, in Greece. Anyway, you can look her up. She's on all the television shows, you know, like National Geographic and Discovery Channel, all that stuff. All right, so if you just type in space archaeologist or space archaeology, she will pop up there, her name and everything. I've forgotten her name. But she's using remote sensing. There's a lot of stuff we can learn. So, aerial photos are the old-timey remote sensing. Now we've got all sorts of new things. There's a thing called LiDAR. You ever heard of LiDAR? LiDAR is it's not radar, but it's sort of similar. Again, you attach it to an airplane, you fly over. It's expensive, that's why a lot of archaeologists don't use it. I worked on one site in Israel where they had used LiDAR, a place called Jezreel. And they hired a plane, and they got the camera, and they paid the people to do it, and they flew over, and it actually is sort of like ground penetrating radar only from a plane. And it can actually optically, or with telemetrics, I guess they call it, it can remove the vegetation. So if you got a place, like aerial photo, if you get a lot of trees, it kind of hides what's there. With LiDAR, if you have trees or vegetation, it can even penetrate the ground, I don't know how far, a meter or so. So you can start to pick up where wall lines are, roads, and it'll actually go through vegetation. So they've used it a lot in Central America, like Mayan sites, because they got all kinds of vegetation there. So using it in Israel has been kind of rare. They've used it in England, UK, and to some good success there as well. So in this particular aerial photo, what do I see? I see right dead center here a tell. T-E-L-L, tell. It's commonly what you find in the Middle East. That is not a natural hill. Why? Well, take a look at the angles. Look at the angles. There's some very definite angles here. Nature doesn't like angles. Now, these are bedding planes of limestone. But when you start to see right angles, when you start to see a lot of parallel lines like this, that's a good indication that you've got a wall line. In this case, under the ground, but being retained. So if you go there and walk that, in some cases you'll be able to see that wall on the surface. Another thing I see is slightly down from the center. There's a dark semicircle. You see that? Again, that dark semicircle is not natural. So here's the dark semicircle, and here are the parallel lines. This is the tell itself. Well, that dark semicircle was an ancient theater. They built theaters to be semicircles. They quarried, it was quarry. They quarried out the rock, but then they made it for seats. Okay? Then if you see this line right here, it goes through this way. There's a line that's going pretty much left to right across the image, and then there where the vegetation is. This is a road. It's a Roman road. And right here is a bridge. There's a Roman bridge. It's never really been fully excavated, but it's there, and that's a Roman road. So, and there are other building lines down in this area here. You can see some of it here. That's another church building. By the way, these little dots, that's an olive grove. Okay? If you wonder what that is, this is an olive grove. And then this is a wadi, or a valley. There's a spring that's off the bottom of the picture. So, this site is a very old site. It's been occupied for thousands of years. Prior to the early Bronze Age, we even have stuff here that's Chalcolithic, and who knows how long people live here. Why? Because we have a spring. It's a perennial spring. It means it's always flowing. People still from the surrounding villages come here to get their water. They come with trucks and they pump it out into tanker trucks, and then they haul it to the villages and pump it up to the tanks on their roof for gravity feed water. Okay? And it's good water. It's cold, it's fresh water. That's what's drawn people to this area. People must have water to live. All right, so these are the ways we know where to dig and how we find things that are there. I guess we have to end